So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And how do you feel disappointed without a typhoon leave? All right. So although there is a typhoon passing through Taiwan, but we still have to have our class today. Right. Last week we talked about two types of sales taxes. One is ad valorem tax, which is 从价税. Ad valorem is a proportion tax according to the price. And we have another type of tax, which is specific or unit tax. It's according to the quantity. So for each quantity you sell or you buy, there is a tax levied on the good. Now, let's have a look at the diagram here. All right, initially we have a demand curve and a supply curve. The demand curve represents the willingness for consumers to buy, to purchase the good. Okay, so the height of the demand curve represents the willingness, the highest willingness or the maximum willingness to pay. So at most, what is the price you are willing to pay for the quantity of good? That is the perspective, the vertical perspective of demand curve. And the supply curve, the supply reflects the cost for producing the good. So this would be the least price, the lowest price. The seller are willing to sell the good. Without this price, or with some price lower than the height, lower than the least willingness, then the seller would not be willing to sell because they will earn a negative profit, right? So since the height here represents the cost, then you have to charge a price higher than the cost. Otherwise, you will lose money, right? Now, the government says that, all right, for producers, if you want to sell a good, then I will charge you per unit a tax, which is tau. This is a Greek letter, tau. Okay? And the size is tau for per unit of good. Then the supply curve shifts upward parallelly by tau. And without this taxation, initially the demand and supply curves cut each other at the point we call it equilibrium. And P0 is the equilibrium price, Q0 the equilibrium quantity. Is it clear? Should be easy for you, right? Now, the supply curve shifts upward, which means the willingness to sell arises by tau, because the tax can be regarded as a part of the cost, right? You produce something by the cost of, say, $50, and now the government wanna charge you or tax you by $10. So at the least, you are willing to sell the good. You will charge at the least $60. Otherwise, you will lose money, right? So this is the willingness faced by the consumer, because the sellers requires or asks for this kind of prices. Otherwise, they are not willing to sell. Okay? So the new equilibrium here corresponding to P1 and Q1. So now P1 is a price that the consumer has to pay. Otherwise, the consumer cannot buy this kind of good, right? So this price, P1, is what the consumer has to pay. And Q1 is the quantity. Q1 is the quantity after taxation. And we have another price, P2 here. And P2, what is P2? P2 is what, or the price the supplier, the seller, receive. So there is a gap between P1 and P2. The consumer pays P1. However, the seller, the producer, receives P2. There is a gap, and this gap, who gets the gap? Where is the gap go? Where does the gap go? Go to the government, right? So it's in a form of tax. In a form of tax. So for each unit, this is tau. This is tau. The size is tau, which is unit tax. And since the quantity purchased or transacted is Q1, so this part is actually the amount of taxation. Okay? So this is the tax earned or received by the government. Last week, I think we have already talked about this triangle. What do we call this triangle? What do we call it? Deadweight loss, right? This is deadweight loss. And last week we have already talked about this. If we have a flatter supply curve and demand curve, then with the same unit of tax, tau, which is tau, then the deadweight loss will become greater here, right? Because delta Q, the quantity dropped, is larger for this one, is flatter. And they are steeper, so the quantity dropped is smaller. And the area of the triangle, you know the formula, right? The base times the height divided by 2 is the formula for the triangle, is that right? So with the same base, tau, with the same base, since the height here is larger, then the area of deadweight loss will become larger for flatter demand curve and supply curves. And the other issue is about, this is the original price without taxation, without this tax. Initially, buyers and sellers transact at price P0. Now the consumer has to pay P1, which means the consumers pay a little bit higher, right? And initially, the seller receives P0, but now P2 instead. So the price for each unit of good, the price the seller can receive is lower a little bit. The buyer pays a little bit higher, the seller receives a little bit lower, so they share the gap. We call this as the tax incidence. Which means how do we divide the tax to consumers, buyers, and producers, sellers. We call this issue as tax incidence. And last week, I have given you an example, something look like this. A deep supply curve and a deep demand curve and flat supply curve. So if there is a tax, we call this as a tax wedge, tau. So we just put the tax wedge vertically between demand and supply. Put it vertically. And the size is tau. We call this as a tax wedge. And you will see how the buyer and the seller divide tau. In this case, the buyer share the big parts for the tax, right? That is because the price elasticity of demand is higher or smaller. It's a big elasticity or a small elasticity. Which do you think? Is a large or a small one? Elasticity. So go back to the idea, the concept of elasticity, which means there is a stimulus, something affects you to change. Now, the source of the change comes from the price, right? The source of the change is the price. So facing a higher price, you will be willing to buy less. And the extent is not very large. The size is not very large, which means you are some kind of inelastic person. Okay? But for the supply, for the seller, for the producer, it is a elastic supply curve, because for the same percentage change in price, for 1% change in price, the seller, the quantity supplied would be arise dramatically. Okay? So this is a high elasticity for demand. Low elasticity for demand. It's low and it's high elasticity for supply. So the more elastic you are, the less burden of the tax you share. Okay? Just remember this, and I will explain, say, a few hours later. The more elastic you are, the less the burden you share of the tax. Okay? Maybe I can show you now. We don't have to wait for it. Okay, think about this. If we have this kind of triangle here, and we make it A, B, C, D. We make some notation here, some symbols. And how about AB divided by BD? What is this? This is the slope of the demand curve, right? This is the slope of the demand curve, so we may make it by the slope of the demand curve. And what about BC and BD? BC, BD, which is the slope of the supply curve. Is that right? Okay? Now, let's make the proportional of what is? Okay, AB to BC. How about AB to BC? We just divided these two ratios, right? So we will cancel off BD. And then it is the slope of demand curve by the slope of supply curve. Is that right? And how can we interpret the proportion of AB to BC? So this is the part the consumer have to share, the tax share of consumer. And the tax share of seller in the denominator, right? The proportion that is shared by the consumer, the proportion that is shared by the producer. Is that clear? Which is what we call AB, BC. Is that right? Okay? Alright, so now, what about if we make it as 1 over ms and 1 over md? And we make it tangent theta here. What is tangent theta? This point, the tangent, this is the theta, okay? So the angle of the straight line connecting the origin and point D here, which is tangent theta, okay? The angle is theta, and we call this as the tangent. Tangent divided by a slope, what is that? We have mentioned that last week, right? It's elasticity, is that right? So, okay, where should I put it? Okay, here. It would be the elasticity of supply and the elasticity for demand, right? the price elasticity of supply, the price of elasticity of demand, because it's a tangent divided by the slope of demand curve. All right, so what do we say? Now in this case, the elasticity of demand is low. So it's a small elasticity and a big elasticity of supply, right? So this ratio must be a large number. Is that clear? It's flat, which means it is elastic. It's steep, which means it is inelastic. So the elasticity of demand would be small and the elasticity of supply would be large. So a large elasticity of supply divided by a small elasticity of demand gives us a high ratio, right? A ratio of a pretty high number. So the share by consumer to seller would be a high number, which means the share by the consumer would be larger. Get the logic? In this case, the slope of the demand curve and the absolute value of the slope of the supply curve is about equal, right? It's similar. So you will see the share is about 1/2, right? It's similar. That is because in that case, the elasticity is similar. So it's about 1 to 1. So the share for the consumer and the share for the seller will be close to 1 to 1. Okay? So if you are someone elastic, which means when the shock, the price change shock, when this shock comes, you can escape a large scale, right? You can adjust a large scale, which means elastic. So if the price goes up and you are a supplier, then you will increase a lot your supply, the quantity you supplied. And if you are a consumer, in contrast, the price goes up for a little bit and you are inelastic. Even the price goes up a large scale and you will escape just a little bit because you are inelastic. You cannot just escape from the trap. You are trapped, which means you are inelastic. Get it? So, the one cannot get away from the shock, would share the larger burden, the larger portion of the tax burden. So get the intuition. I hope you've got this kind of intuition. Think about this. In a relationship, for a couple, in a love relationship, if someone who has more opportunity, then this person would be more elastic in a fight, right? If you don't want to be with me, then I will escape. So let's break up, since there is a lot of people waiting for me, right? So I'm more elastic. And the less elastic one will feel more pain because he or she is relatively inelastic. Get the point? Okay, any question here? So now I have derived, or I have give you the inference about how the share between consumer and seller related to the elasticity inversely. Okay, this is for the demand side. The share of the demand side is inversely related to the elasticity of demand. Get the point? So the relation between elasticity and the tax burden is inverse. Okay, now let's proceed to the next slide, which is about some math. But before that, I'd like to talk about a little bit about the ad valorem tax. With a specific tax, the supply curve just shifts up parallelly, shift upward parallelly. But for ad valorem tax, the supply curve rotates at the pivot here is the horizontal intercept. Using this as the pivot, the supply curve rotates upward or rotates counterclockwise. Okay? Because it is about the price. So for the initial price P0, now you are taxed by a proportion 1 plus T. T is the tax rate. Okay? So if the initially you are paying say $50, say $50. Now there is a say 10% tax on you. So 10% tax, which means you have to pay 50, 1 plus 10%. Is that right? So it becomes 55 now. Right? So with the same quantity, 50%, and it would be 1.1 here, it would be 55. If this is, say, 40, then this height would be 44. Is that clear? So since it's a proportional change, or proportion change, so the supply curve multiplied by 1 plus T, it is a form of the rotation. We just rotate the supply curve using this as the pivot because it's 0. The height is 0 here, right? So we rotate. So this case is the ad valorem tax. If you want to analyze using this kind of diagram. If it is a specific tax using this parallel shift upward shift for specific tax, rotation for ad valorem tax. Any question?